everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the land down under. We're headed back to Australia when a young boy just mysteriously disappeared from a bus stop in Queensland one afternoon in 2003. A police search quickly ensued to try and find him. However, he was nowhere to be found. It literally seemed as though he'd just vanished into thin air. For the next 8 years, the search for him continued as this case became one of the largest and most extensively investigated crimes in Queensland's history. Eventually, the detectives identified a top suspect, an individual who had a history of committing the most heinous crimes against children. So they were pretty sure that he was responsible for this one too. But in order to prove it, the police had to launch a huge undercover operation which went on for months and months whilst they tried to coax a confession out of the perpetrator. It was a very risky operation. One wrong move and they could blow their whole cover and this child killer could continue to walk free. This case is honestly one of the most interesting that I think I've ever covered in terms of how the police went about solving it. So I cannot wait to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's delve into the tragic story of Daniel Morcombe. But just quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a big thank you to Surfshark for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Surfshark is a virtual private networking service that helps to keep you and your personal data safe online from scammers and cyber criminals by basically encrypting all of the information sent between your device and the internet. A VPN works by masking your IP address and making it appear as though you are operating from another country, and it's something that I use literally every single day and I honestly could not go without one now. I personally use a VPN not just to keep myself safe online but also for work purposes. Obviously making true crime videos is my job and it entails pulling information about cases from different online sources such as news articles, some of which are not always available in my region. Like with the case I have to share with you today, it's an Australian case, meaning that I couldn't access a lot of the articles because I'm based in the UK, but I just used Surfshark to change my location and voila, I got access. But I also use Surfshark a lot in my downtime too. With a VPN you can unblock streaming platforms and access content libraries from all over the world. Often when I'm just relaxing in the evenings after a long day of work, I'll use Surfshark to browse the different Netflix libraries that each country has to offer, because I'm not gonna lie, I feel like I've watched just about everything that the UK Netflix has to offer at this point. Recently I've really been enjoying browsing the Canadian Netflix actually. But equally a VPN would also be super useful for people who travel a lot or are going travelling. It means that you can keep up to date with your favourite TV shows from back home by, again, just simply changing your location to your home country. Surfshark has more than 3,200 servers in 100 countries. They don't monitor, track or store what you do online, and their clean web feature blocks ads, trackers, malware and phishing attempts, making it even easier for you to browse the internet safely. And they even offer 24/7 support and a 30-day money-back guarantee, so I highly recommend that you guys check them out. And you can do so by clicking the link in the description box, and if you sign up via my link, then Surfshark will very kindly give you 4 extra months off of a Surfshark subscription for free. That's surfshark.com/Mollie for an extra 4 months free. Thank you once again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a teenage boy and it involves heavy themes such as paedophilia and the rape and sexual assault of children. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back approaching 21 years now to late 2003 on the Sunshine Coast of southeast Queensland in Australia. And this is Daniel James Morcombe. He was a 13-year-old boy who lived on the Sunshine Coast with his family. Daniel was born on the 19th of December 1989 to his parents Bruce and Denise Morcombe, and he was one of 3 children, one of 3 brothers. He had an older brother named Dean and his other brother was actually Daniel's twin. He had a twin named Bradley. The Morcombe family lived in a house located in a rural town called Palm Woods on the Sunshine Coast, and the Morcombe Morcombe brothers were always very close with their mum and dad. Bruce and Denise Morcombe were said to have been just very, very loving parents, and Daniel was a happy little 13-year-old boy. Daniel was described as being quite a shy and quiet boy for the most part, but he was also said to have been very helpful and caring. He was also a big animal lover. He adored animals, and the Morcombe family had quite a few pet animals, including a pony whom Daniel just loved. Daniel's interests also include motorbikes and motocross, an interest that he shared with his brothers Dean and Bradley. And Daniel was also just a very sweet and kind teenage boy. His mother Denise recalled how Daniel would often bring her flowers and little gifts when he came home. Like, I think whilst he was just walking home a lot of the time, he would stop and pick some flowers for his mum. He was clearly just very thoughtful. And yeah, the Morcombe family seemed to be just a very normal, happy little family of 5 living on the Sunshine Coast. That was until December of 2003, when life for the Morcombes changed forever, and in the most tragic way, when 13-year-old Daniel just suddenly vanished one day without a trace. It was the 7th of December 2003. It was a Sunday, and a day that initially began like any other for the Morcombes. Daniel and his brothers had actually been fruit picking that morning, which was something that they often did. They would help out their neighbours by picking fruit for them during harvest time, and I think that they would get a little bit of pocket money for helping out with this, which was obviously exciting for them, being able to earn some money. And then after they finished fruit picking, Daniel actually decided to use his pocket money to go shopping. Of course, it was December, Christmas was coming up, and he wanted to go out shopping to start buying presents for his friends and family. And so his plan was to go to the Sunshine Plaza shopping centre in the town of Maroochydore in Queensland to look for presents, and also to visit the hair salon. He planned to get his hair cut that day. Now, Bruce and Denise Morcombe, his parents, were actually out of town that day at a works Christmas function, I believe, so they weren't around to give Daniel a lift to the shopping centre. And so instead, Daniel decided to get a bus to Maroochydore. So he left the home that afternoon. He walked for about 13 minutes to the main road until he reached the bus stop, which was located on the Nambour Connection Road under the Keel Mountain Road underpass in the town of Woombye in Queensland, which is only like the next town over from Palm Woods where Daniel lived. And this was a journey that Daniel was very familiar with. His parents had let him take this route and board this bus a number of times before, and he'd always been fine, so, you know, why should this time be any different? Daniel arrived at the bus stop under the underpass shortly before 1:30 p.m. that afternoon, because the bus was due to arrive at his stop at 1:30. However, this bus never actually turned up. What Daniel was unaware of at the time was that the bus had unfortunately broken down further up the road, and so a replacement bus was sent out to carry on the journey to Maroochydore, and this second bus passed Daniel's stop at around 2:10 that afternoon. Now, the bus driver driving the replacement bus would later say that he did remember seeing Daniel at the bus stop by the underpass, and Daniel had his hand out to signal to the bus to stop, but the driver didn't. The bus driver didn't stop because he was running behind schedule, and so he kind of gestured to Daniel as if to say that another bus, a third bus, is coming to pick him up. However, as it would turn out, by the time this third bus arrived at the bus stop, just 3 minutes later, Daniel was gone. There was no sign of him. For some reason, he just mysteriously vanished in those 3 minutes. 3 minutes between bus number 2 and bus number 3 driving past the underpass, and Daniel Morcombe was never seen alive again. A couple of hours later, at around 4:15 p.m, Daniel's parents, Bruce and Denise, returned home from their Christmas function, and they obviously realised that Daniel wasn't home from his shopping trip yet, which they thought was strange, especially Denise. She just said that she had a weird feeling, and she couldn't work out what this weird feeling was, but it was just a gut feeling that something was wrong. And so Denise decided to get into her car and drive to the bus stop to see if Daniel was there, if he had gotten off the bus yet on his way home from the shopping centre. Now, as she was driving to the bus stop, Denise actually saw the 1:30 bus that had broken down earlier that day. It was about to be loaded onto a tow truck, and of course, by the time she reached the underpass, there was no sign of her son. So it was following this when Daniel's parents headed to the Sunshine Plaza shopping centre in Maroochydore, where Daniel was headed that day. They went to the bus stop there and they were informed by the bus driver that the last bus that was going to Daniel's stop was sent out at around 5:05. So thinking that Daniel must have gotten on this bus home, his parents headed home expecting Daniel to be there when they arrived, but he wasn't. Again, there was no sign of him, and like I said, this was the last bus leaving the shopping centre. So if Daniel wasn't on it, then where the hell was he? So of course, as you can imagine, panic was really starting to set in for the Morcombes at this point. They just knew that something was wrong when Daniel wasn't on the last bus. Something must have happened to him. And so later that same evening, they decided to contact the police and report their 13-year-old son as missing. Now, sources seem to suggest that initially the Queensland police didn't actually take this report as seriously as they should have done. They seemed to just assume that Daniel was probably a runaway, so they did apparently face a lot of criticism for that. However, it wasn't too long before they jumped into action and realised that actually there was probably a lot more to it than that. Daniel wasn't the kind of kid that would have run away from home. He had no reason to want to do that. And so the day following this, on the 8th of December 2003, the investigation into the disappearance of Daniel Morcombe was officially launched. And in fact, just 2 days in, the homicide squad was even brought in to assist with this inquiry, as it was feared that foul play may have been involved here. Very soon into the investigation, the police also appealed to the public alongside Daniel's family. In fact, just 3 days after Daniel vanished, his heartbroken parents, Bruce and Denise, did a television appeal in which they pleaded for anyone with any information regarding their son's whereabouts to come forward. The police also placed a mannequin dressed in identical clothing as what Daniel was wearing that day at the scene at the bus stop to hopefully jog people's memories. And very quickly, this case spread like wildfire. It wasn't long at all before Daniel's case was all over the news. And as a result of this huge news coverage, several tips and leads came in from members of the public, many of whom recalled having actually seen Daniel waiting at the bus stop that afternoon. The police were quickly able to establish that Daniel never made it to the shopping centre on the day that he went missing. Obviously, he vanished whilst he was standing at the bus stop next to a busy main road, and so several motorists would have passed him, many of which did come forward. They told the police that they recalled having seen a young boy matching Daniel's description. He was wearing shorts and a red t-shirt, and he was standing waiting for the bus. Some witnesses recalled seeing Daniel drawing in the dirt or the sand with a stick whilst he was waiting, and there were also witnesses who reported seeing 1 or 2 older men also at the bus stop with Daniel. Reports also came in from witnesses who described seeing a blue-coloured car at the scene parked on the side of the road, and there were reports of a white courier-type van being parked nearby as well. And this composite sketch of one of the men seen standing near Daniel at the bus stop was created and released to the public. The police honestly had so many tips and leads that they had to sift through from the public. As I said, news of Daniel's disappearance spread rapidly around the whole of Queensland. I mean, around the whole country, really. And naturally, everyone was terrified and they felt so sorry for the Morcombe family. The public just wanted to help as much as they could. And so as well as the police out searching for Daniel, countless volunteers came forward to assist with the search too. And they were looking everywhere. Of course, the police heavily focused on the area around the bus stop to start with, but they also expanded the search and they started searching nearby bodies of water and wooded areas and bushlands for any trace of Daniel. They were also conducting door-to-door inquiries. Missing posters with Daniel's face on were created and distributed, not just in Queensland, but soon enough nationwide. All hands were on deck to spread the word of his disappearance as much as possible, and this was largely thanks to Daniel's parents, Bruce and Denise. They did countless TV appeals in the days and weeks after Daniel went missing. They were determined to keep his name, keep his picture in the news, because obviously the more people in Australia became aware of his case, the better chance they had of finding their son. And like I said, the public were in their corner pretty much right from day one, wanting to help and offer the Morcombe support in any way that they could. They received so many donations from the public to continue funding the search for Daniel, to continue funding the creation of posters and billboards and appeals. Daniel's face face was even on milk cartons and pizza boxes. He was everywhere. Everyone in Australia knew Daniel's case. He became Australia's most recognised missing person ever, really. In fact, this is incredible, but there was even a truck driver named Dave who would travel along the Sunshine Coast and other areas for work every single week, and he decided to turn his huge truck into a billboard for Daniel. He had a massive picture of him put on the side of it, along with a picture of the composite sketch of the man seen interacting with Daniel at the bus stop. I mean, it was incredibly clever, really. Dave knew with how far he travelled each week, his van would be seen by thousands and thousands of people. So he just wanted to do his bit to help spread awareness of Daniel's disappearance. But despite everyone's best efforts, the best efforts of the public, Daniel's loved ones and the police, tragically weeks and months went by and there was nothing. The police were no closer to figuring out what on earth happened to Daniel that day. I mean, they knew that he had most likely been abducted, but exactly who carried out this crime, they were none the wiser. And soon enough, the months without answers turned into years. Years started to pass and Daniel's poor family were just left without answers. They had no closure whatsoever. No idea if Daniel was dead or if he was still alive and out there somewhere and possibly still in danger. I mean, the fear that they must have felt for his safety every single day is just heartbreaking to imagine. But one thing that the Morcombes never ever did was give up. They never gave up the search for their son. They continued to, make the posters, do the appeals, raise awareness as much as possible. But also, for Bruce and Denise Morcombe, they knew that they had to do more than that. As well as continuing the search for Daniel, they just felt like more had to be done to educate the children of Australia on stranger danger. Because, as I said, it seemed more than likely that Daniel had probably been kidnapped by a stranger on the day that he vanished, and the Morcombes felt like, as well as raising awareness of their son's disappearance, they needed to raise awareness of these potentially dangerous predators that could be out there looking to target and abduct children and teenagers. And so, in May of 2005, about a year and a half after Daniel went missing, Bruce and Denise launched the Daniel Morcombe Foundation. And we're going to talk more about the foundation and the incredible work that they've done and continue to do towards the end of this video. But it was originally set up as a way to fundraise for the search efforts for Daniel, but over the years it became much more than just that. As I said, they started to also focus on keeping other kids safe by teaching them about stranger danger, because the Morcombes just didn't want any other family to ever have to go through what they were going through. The investigation into Daniel's disappearance continued over the years. It was never closed. In fact, it became one of the most extensively investigated cases in Queensland's history. And by late 2008, so the 5-year anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, a $1 million reward for information was put forward. A quarter of this was put forward by the Australian government, but the rest was donated privately by just a member of the public, probably a local businessman or woman, I would imagine. The Morcombes carried on their own searches for Daniel, I think kind of separate from the police investigation. They would follow up on their own leads that they had received, and Bruce and Denise described how during one of their searches at a junk pile or a junkyard, I think, they spotted some red material. And knowing that obviously their son was wearing a red t-shirt on the day that he vanished, they literally got on the ground, got on their hands and knees and started digging. Just digging with their hands and their nails, but of course it wasn't Daniel and it wasn't his red t-shirt. But they were prepared to go to any lengths to find their son and get justice for him, even speaking to known paedophiles and predators themselves and asking if they had any information regarding what happened to their son. And then in 2009, Bruce and Denise Morcombe decided to reach out to the state coroner asking for a coronial inquest to be held in Daniel's case. Now, a coronial inquest is essentially an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the death of a person when their cause of death is is unknown and remains unclear because, I mean, as I said, this was 2009. It had been 6 years since Daniel went missing, and I think tragically everyone knew that he most likely was dead by this point. And as we know, the police investigation into his disappearance had reached a bit of a standstill. The detectives didn't really have many solid leads to go on, but what the police had gathered over the years was a long list of people of interest. In the years since Daniel's disappearance, the police had looked at several known criminals, sex offenders, paedophiles, but they'd never been able to definitively link any of them to the crime, to Daniel's abduction and probable murder. So what the Morcombes wanted from this inquest was for every single individual that had ever been considered a person of interest in Daniel's case, every sexual predator, every paedophile, to be required to come to court to be cross-examined under oath about Daniel's disappearance. I guess to see if any of them were guilty of this crime, to see if they would crack, essentially, and confess under the pressure. And thankfully, the state coroner agreed to this inquest, and it began in October of 2010, and it went on for about 6 months or so until April of 2011. And one by one, different individuals were brought in and questioned under oath. And of course, Bruce and Denise Morcombe were there for the entire thing, watching as each person was cross-examined. However, there was one individual, one man in particular, that really stood out to the Morcombes during the inquest, to Daniel's mother, Denise Morcombe especially. This man was cross-examined on the 31st of March 2011, and Denise recalled how as soon as he walked into the courtroom, she just got this insane cold shiver down her spine. She turned around to look at the man, and she described how instantly she knew. She just knew that this man had involvement in her son's disappearance. She couldn't explain it, but it was just like a mother's intuition, and she turned to her husband Bruce and said, "That's him." Which is just mad, isn't it? The fact that before this man even spoke, Denise just had a gut feeling that he had information about what had happened to Daniel. The man's name was P7. Or at least that's the name that he was given during the inquest. Each individual that was cross-examined was given a different fake name, I suppose. They didn't go by their real names. But P7's real name was Brett Peter Cowan. He was born in 1969, making him around 41 years old by this time in 2011. He was originally from the city of Bunbury in Western Australia. However, he was now living in Perth. And he had been looked at as a person of interest in the Daniel Morcombe case rather early on. Actually, he was interviewed by detectives just 2 weeks into the search for Daniel. In this interview, he denied having any involvement in Daniel's disappearance, and he claimed that on the afternoon in question, the afternoon that Daniel vanished, he was with his drug dealer. Now, Brett Peter Cowan said the same during the inquest as he did in his first interview. He denied under oath having anything to do with whatever had happened to Daniel. And at the time of his first interview, Brett Peter Cowan was just one of many men that the police were looking at as possibly being responsible, and they never had any solid evidence linking him to Daniel's disappearance, so he was never really considered more than just a person of interest. He wasn't like a top suspect in the case. But you may be wondering, well, why was he even a person of interest in the first place? What about Brett Peter Cowan made alarm bells ring? Well, it was simply the fact that he was a paedophile, a convicted paedophile. He had a history of committing the most horrific crimes, sexual assaults against children. So let's delve a bit more into his background. As I said, Brett Peter Cowan was born on the 18th of September 1969 in Bunbury to his parents Peter and Marlene Cowan. Marlene worked for the RSL, the Returned and Services League of Australia, an organisation which provides help and support to those serving in the Australian Defence Force, and his father Peter was a Vietnam veteran and a major in the Australian Army. Brett was one of 4 children, one of 4 brothers, of which he was the second youngest, and the Cowan boys were raised in a pretty strict Catholic household, and as you would expect, their father was away a lot due to his job, meaning that their mother Marlene was kind of the main caretaker. But the family eventually relocated to Brisbane, where Brett became a student at the Marcellin College, which was actually a high school in Northside Brisbane, and and he was actually described as being, quote, despised by his peers in school. He was said to have been a bully to other kids and also just a general creep. According to one report, he would literally go around school showing his peers when he had an erection. But anyway, he dropped out of school when he was around 15, 16, and he kind of went from job to job for a while. He was never able to keep a job for very long, to be honest. He got involved in drugs. He started taking drugs like methamphetamines and LSD, cocaine, and he started committing crimes at a very, very young age. At just 17, 18 years old, he started committing thefts and burglaries, and as a result of this and his drug-related offences, he was ordered by the court to perform community service duties at a public park in Brisbane, which happens to be exactly what he was doing on the day that he carried out what is believed to be his first sexually motivated attack on a young child. This attack took place 16 years before Daniel Morcombe disappeared on the 5th of December 1987. As I said, that day, 18-year-old Brett Cowan was attending one of his community service sessions by working in a local park. Now, near to this park was a childcare centre, and so the kids who attended this childcare centre would often play in the park. And one child who was out playing that day was Timothy Nichols, who was just 7 years old in 1987. Tim was playing in the park with some of his friends when he came across Brett Cowan whilst he was like clearing away some leaves or something, doing his community service. And Timothy, being the helpful little boy that he was, decided to offer Cowan some help alongside some of the other kids from the centre. So he started chatting to Cowan, helping him with his work in the park, and Tim described how initially Cowan seemed really, really nice and friendly. He was very chatty with the kids and everything seemed fine. But of course, what Tim was unaware of, being a 7-year-old boy, was that Cowan had taken an interest in him, a sexual interest. And so for the next hour or so, Cowan essentially tried to groom Tim Nichols, like I said, being very, very friendly, overly friendly, asking Tim to help him with certain jobs, kind of trying to make Tim feel special, I suppose. He was trying to play with Tim. And then at one point, Cowan asked Tim and the other kids who were there if they wanted a golf ball. He said, "Who wants a golf ball?" And all of the kids immediately put their hands up, including Tim, as if to say, "Me, I want the golf ball." And so Cowan pointed at Tim and said that he could have it, he could have the golf ball, but only if he agreed to come into the public toilets in the park with him, which naturally I think Tim thought was just really strange, and so he said no. And it was then when Cowan just grabbed him. He grabbed this 7-year-old boy. He put his hands over his mouth so that he couldn't shout and scream, and he carried a terrified Tim straight to the toilets. He locked Tim inside one of the toilets with him, and it was there where he sexually assaulted the 7-year-old. He raped him a number of times. It's just sickening. I mean, to think about the fear that this poor little boy must have experienced at the hands of this monster. Tim was asking Cowan to stop, even saying to him that if he didn't, he would tell his mum. However, Cowan just threatened Tim, and he said that if he told anyone about this, then he would kill him. Thankfully, Tim did survive this horrific attack, as when one of the childcare workers realised that Tim was missing, she started calling out for him in the park, and she shouted outside of the public toilets, quote, "Tim, are you in there?" And Tim was saved. But of course, the trauma that this assault left Tim with has never gone away. The impact that it had on him was enormous. Tim describes how what happened to him just took the happiness from his life instantly. He was never, ever the same after this, understandably. And in fact, even to this day, Tim struggles to really go into detail about what Cowan did to him in those toilets, because it's just too painful for him to discuss it, to have to relive the abuse that he suffered that day. Now, Cowan did try to go on the run following this crime, but thankfully he was eventually caught and arrested, and he went to trial for the rape of Tim Nichols, during which Tim very bravely stood as a witness and he testified against him. He had to stand up and describe in court what Cowan did to him in the toilet. And sickeningly, Tim recalls looking leaning over to Cowan during the trial and Cowan smiling and smirking at him, which is just vile. This is a man that has destroyed the life of a 7-year-old boy who has completely stolen the innocence from his childhood, and he's smirking at him during his trial for rape as if it's some kind of joke. He clearly had no remorse whatsoever for what he had done to Tim. Cowan was convicted of Tim's rape in 1989. However, this is literally going to drive you insane, but during his sentencing, he was given 2 years in prison. 2 years for the brutal rape of a 7-year-old boy. And guess what? He didn't even serve all of this sentence. He was let out after just over a year. Honestly, in all my time of making true crime videos, I don't think anything has ever made me feel so angry and disgusted. What on earth? He was released after a year for repeatedly sexually assaulting a child. I mean, what kind of message does that send to other sexual predators like Cowan? Oh, it's fine, you can commit one of the most horrific and evil of crimes and the most you'll serve is like a year in prison. And so naturally, after he was let out, what was Cowan thinking? Well, I can do it again. If the most I'll serve is like a year or 2 behind bars, I'll take my chances and assault another innocent child in order to satisfy my twisted, perverted desires. And so that's exactly what he did in 1993, just a few years after his release from prison on the 23rd of September 1993. Whilst Cowan was living in a caravan park in the city of Darwin in Australia, he lured this 6-year-old boy who also lived in the caravan park into some bushes in this nearby abandoned car yard, and it was there when Cowan did the same to him as he did to Tim Nichols. He assaulted him and raped him, and this attack was so brutal and so violent that this poor boy actually suffered a punctured lung and a broken collarbone as a result. I think Cowan had also cut the boy several times. He tried to suffocate him, and then once he was finished, once he was satisfied, he actually put this boy, who was still alive, in the boot of an abandoned car. He shut the door and he just walked away, leaving him in there to die alone. And unbelievably, his girlfriend at the time, her name was Tracy, she would later tell the police that when Brett returned home to their caravan, he slept with her. Well, he raped her effectively. Tracy said that she didn't like what he was doing during the act, how he was treating her, and she told him to just go away and leave her alone. And how disturbing is that? The fact that he had just molested and raped a 6-year-old boy and left him for dead, and then immediately after he wants to have sex with his girlfriend. Once again, there was no remorse there whatsoever. In fact, he was still aroused and turned on by what he had done. By some miracle, this 6-year-old boy actually managed to get himself out of this abandoned car despite his injuries, and he walked back to the caravan park where his family had been desperately searching for him for I think hours by this point. And initially everyone thought that he'd been hit by a car. His injuries were that bad they thought that he'd been involved in some kind of road accident, but of course it was quickly established that that wasn't what had happened. This innocent little boy had been violently attacked and sexually assaulted. So the police were quickly called in to investigate. They started questioning everyone in the caravan park, including Brett Peter Cowan, who tried to act as not guilty as possible. He even made out to the detectives that he was just as angry as everyone else about what had happened to this little boy, saying to them, quote, "I hope you catch the bastard who did this." However, despite acting as if he was so angry and repulsed by this crime, he actually refused to give the police a sample of his DNA. They'd been able to collect traces of the attacker's semen from the boy's underwear. So they were asking all of the men who lived in the caravan park to give voluntary DNA samples so that their DNA could be compared against the attackers. And Brett Peter Cowan was the only man who refused to do so. So the police knew from that moment on that he was responsible, and eventually he cracked, he confessed. He was given a number of charges in relation to the attack on this little boy. However, for some reason, the charge of attempted murder was actually dropped just before he went to trial. No idea why, but it was. And once again, his sentence was incredibly lenient. He received just 7 years in prison. But once again, he was let out after serving about half of this sentence. And by 1997, he was a free man. This dangerous child sex offender was just free to walk the streets. He was free when Daniel Morcombe vanished in December of 2003. Now, as I mentioned, Cowan was looked at as a person of interest very early on into the Daniel Morcombe investigation. However, he was one of many men that was being looked into. And at the time, the police didn't have any solid evidence to link him to the crime, so he wasn't ruled out, but he also wasn't like really focused on too much. Now, what's interesting is that in Cowan's first interview, he did actually admit to the police that he had driven past the bus stop that Daniel vanished from on the day that he disappeared. He said that he'd driven past because he was on his way to pick up a mulcher or something. So he literally put himself at the scene, but he still denied having any involvement in Daniel's disappearance. However, it was around the same time as the coronial inquest in 2010/2011 when Brett Peter Cowan quickly went from being just a person of interest in the case to pretty much the top suspect, because by this point they had started delving further into his alibi from that afternoon. If you remember, he said that he'd been with a drug dealer at the time that Daniel vanished. Well, by 2011 the police were able to determine that that was a lie. He'd lied about his whereabouts, meaning that there was no one who could account for his movements that day. It seemed as though Brett Peter Cowan would have had the opportunity to carry out Daniel's kidnapping. So upon discovering that this alibi was false, the police really believed that Brett Peter Cowan was their guy. He was the monster that abducted and probably killed Daniel Morcombe back in late 2003. But how on earth were they going to prove it? They still hadn't found Daniel, and this was now like 8 years on from his disappearance. How were they possibly going to obtain evidence that proved Cowan was the perpetrator? Well, it seemed like the only way would be through Cowan himself, through a confession, which of course they were not likely to get. There was no way that he was going to admit his guilt to the detectives anytime soon, and they knew that. But maybe, just maybe, he would confess to someone that he trusted or could learn to trust over time. And so with this theory in mind, the Queensland detectives came up with a plan. They decided to launch a sting operation, a covert undercover police operation to try and extract an admission of guilt from Cowan. It was known as the Mr. Big procedure, which you may have heard of before in the true crime world, although it's not really a method that is used often at all by police. But Mr. Big is essentially a tactic or technique used by undercover police in order to get a confession from a suspect in a case. And how they go about doing this is they basically pose as a criminal gang, and they act as though they want the suspect to enlist in this gang, become a member. And that way, over time, they hope to build up a level of trust with the suspect until eventually they reach a point where they feel that they can, well, they can tell them anything and everything, tell them what crimes they have committed. And this Mr. Big operation against Brett Peter Cowan had actually already begun by the time Cowan was ordered to attend the inquest into Daniel's case. Now, the inquest took place in Brisbane, and as we know, by this point, Cowan was living in Perth, and so after he attended the inquest, he boarded a plane which was taking him back to Perth. This was in early April of 2011. So to begin the operation, detectives had an undercover police officer sit next to Cowan on his flight back home and befriend him, basically. The undercover officer told Cowan that his name was Joe, and he started telling him about how he was involved in this criminal gang that carried out crimes such as theft and burglaries, drug trade, trafficking weapons, pimp work, etc, and how every member of the gang was loaded, essentially, how they would all make so much money from these crimes that they would commit together. And Joe basically asked Cowan on the flight if he would be interested in joining, in becoming a member of this gang. And Cowan, being the corrupt and immoral individual that he was, said yes, he agreed. Jackpot. He'd fallen for the trap. So he and Joe exchanged contact details on this flight, and following on from here, they kept in touch. Joe introduced Cowan to the other members of the criminal gang, each of whom, unbeknownst to Cowan, were of course also undercover police officers. And over the coming months, Cowan was basically led to believe that he was going through this initiation period in the gang. They would ask for his assistance with these fake criminal scenarios, which obviously he thought were all real. They were kind of grooming this man in a way. Slowly over time, they were gaining his confidence, gaining his trust more and more, to the point where Cowan probably felt like these men, these gang members, were family almost. I think they would even refer to themselves as like criminal brothers who would always have each other's backs, would always stick by one another no matter what. In fact, I believe the gang's mantra was loyalty, honesty and respect. And Cowan was over the moon. He was earning money, he'd made these new criminal friends, this was the life for him. Apparently he even said to the gang members, quote, "I found the job that I've been waiting for all these years." He was none the wiser, completely clueless that this was all a trap, and he was falling for it. He was like a moth to a flame. And then around 4 to 5 months into the operation, in August of 2011, this was a real slow burner, about 4 to 5 months in, Cowan was told by the gang that he had an opportunity to be a part of this big drug trafficking related job in which he could earn $100,000. However, there was a problem. The gang wanted Cowan to be on board with this job. However, they told him that they'd learned that he'd been a person of interest in the Daniel Morcombe investigation and that he'd recently been issued a subpoena for his alibi on the day that Daniel disappeared. And this concerned the gang. They wanted Cowan to be a member, but they couldn't have anything like this putting their criminal activity at risk. And so they told Cowan that they had arranged for him to meet with the leader of the gang, Mr. Big, the big crime boss, a man named Arnold, so that they could basically talk all of this over, and also for his like final induction into the gang, I suppose. The detectives were hoping that this meeting with Arnold, also an undercover officer, would finally be the time that they would get their confession from Brett Cowan. They had this meeting between Arnold and Cowan take place in a hotel in Perth. They set up secret cameras and recording devices in there so that, of course, if they did get a confession from Cowan, it would all be captured on tape. And then in early August of 2011, the meeting took place. Arnold sat down with Cowan. They started talking about this $100,000 job that Cowan had the opportunity to be a part of. However, Arnold told Cowan that if he wanted to be recruited for it, he had one condition for him. So as not to jeopardize the job or the criminal gang, Cowan had to tell Arnold everything. Absolutely everything that he had done in his criminal past, so that Arnold could fix it if he needed to, could make sure that Cowan hadn't made any mistakes which could lead to him eventually getting caught for whatever he had done and going to prison. And Arnold kept saying to Cowan words along the lines of, "Look, I don't care what you've done in your past, it makes no odds to me, but whatever it is, you need to tell me so that we can stop it possibly having a detrimental effect on my criminal organization." And once again, just like Cowan had done throughout this whole operation, he fell for it. He took the bait. And in that hotel room, approaching 8 years after the crime, he finally admitted that yes, he was responsible for the kidnap and murder of 13-year-old Daniel Morcombe, a crime which he had so far gotten away with. And his confession was caught on tape. Now, there are clips of his confession to Arnold online. I'm unsure if I'll be able to play them in this video for copyright reasons. If I can, I will. But if not, I will leave a link to the confession video in the description box for anyone who wants to see it after watching this video. Cowan detailed to the crime boss Arnold about how on that fateful day, the 7th of December 2003, he drove past the bus stop on the Nambour Connection Road in his white-coloured four-wheel drive, and it was there where he spotted a young boy, a boy he would eventually come to learn was Daniel Morcombe. And Brett Cowan immediately took an interest in Daniel and clearly decided in that moment that he was going to abduct and sexually assault him, just like he had done previous times in his life with other young boys. So he parked his car, I believe, in a church car park, which was located behind the underpass where the bus stop was, and then he walked down to the bus stop and just started standing behind Daniel from a distance. He was acting as though he was also waiting for the bus. However, Cowan would have known that there was no bus coming because he did drive past the broken down bus just moments before he spotted Daniel, and it's believed that Cowan was the man or one of the men that witnesses recalled seeing at the stop that day. I mean, if you compare a picture of him to the composite sketch, it is pretty damn similar. Anyway, he said that he was just waiting behind Daniel at the stop for a little while until eventually he approached the young boy after the second bus, the replacement bus, passes and doesn't stop. Because if you recall, it was running behind schedule, and so a third bus was being sent out. He approached Daniel, struck up a conversation with him and offered him a lift. He said that his car was parked nearby and that he didn't mind giving Daniel a ride to the shopping centre, and Daniel gratefully accepted. But of course that wasn't Cowan's plan at all. He had no intention of taking Daniel to the shopping centre. Instead, he drove for about half an hour to this secluded farmland area where he knew that there was an abandoned demountable house. It was located on Roy's Road in the town of Beerwah in Australia. And can you even imagine how terrified Daniel must have been? I mean, as I said, Cowan drove for about 30 minutes in a direction away from the shopping centre. So Daniel must have very quickly come to the realisation that this man, this stranger, had lied to him, and he probably knew the danger that he was in. And when they reached Roy's Road, Cowan said that it was there where he strangled Daniel to death. Now, he claimed that he didn't actually sexually assault Daniel because Daniel was just panicking, and so Cowan immediately just strangled him. However, I'm not quite sure if I personally believe that. I think that he probably did sexually assault Daniel and he killed him because he didn't want to be caught this time. As we know, he'd sexually assaulted 2 other little boys before and they survived, and Cowan was sent to prison. Wasn't sent to prison for a very long time, but he was sent to prison, and he didn't want to risk that happening again, and so he probably thought, well, if I kill Daniel, I'm essentially getting rid of the only witness.
Shadow Hunter, alias Brett Cowan, the main suspect in a disappearance of Daniel Morcombe, who went missing in Queensland 7 December 2003. Honesty, trust, respect. All right?
Yeah, okay. You know, yeah, I do.
All right, so you did it, but what I'm saying is, I need to kind of go, I need to strip you right back to the whole thing.
I walked down and sat there, and then the bus drove past, and that's when I said, I'm going down to the shopping centre, do you want a lift?
Yep.
And he's gone, yep. He never got to molest him or anything like that. He panicked, and I panicked and grabbed him around the throat, and before I knew he was dead.
All right, how long did it take for you to strangle him out, do you know?
Didn't seem long.
After Daniel was dead, Cowan told Arnold that he dragged his body down to this embankment area and he literally threw him. He threw this 13-year-old boy down the embankment, which was about 1.5 meters drop. He then walked down the embankment himself and he proceeded to cover Daniel's body with leaves and tree branches and sand so that he wouldn't be seen, and he threw Daniel's clothing into a creek. Another reason why I don't quite believe the I didn't get to molest him story. If he didn't sexually assault Daniel, why did he strip him of his clothing and throw it in a creek? Cowan also claimed that he did return to the site a couple of days after the murder just to check if Daniel's body was still there, and apparently when he arrived he realised that animals had kind of descended on his remains and had taken most of him away. However, he did notice Daniel's skull was still there, and so he proceeded to smash it to pieces with a shovel. So that was Cowan's story. That was the account that he gave to Arnold. Now Arnold, still pretending to be the boss of this fake crime gang, asked Cowan if he would go back to Queensland with some members of the gang and show them the spot where he left Daniel's body all those years ago, just so that they could make sure that he'd left no evidence behind, nothing that could be traced back to him. And so on the 11th of August 2011, that's exactly what he did. They arrived on Roy's Road in Queensland and Cowan talked them through the crime again, showing them where he threw Daniel's body off of the embankment, and he was none the wiser that the members members of the gang who he had just shown Daniel's burial site to were still in fact undercover officers, and he was none the wiser that there were other police officers hiding nearby the scene just waiting to apprehend him. And after he'd shown them the burial site, that time came. As soon as they started walking away, the hidden officers moved in and they arrested Brett Cowan for the abduction and murder of Daniel Morcombe. And Cowan would have finally come to the realization that he had been deceived. I mean, he probably thought after all these years of getting away with Daniel's murder that he was invincible. He was way smarter than the police, but clearly he wasn't smart enough to have fallen for something like this. This was his downfall. Following Cowan's arrest, obviously the detectives had search teams scour the area on Roy's Road where the murder took place, and these search efforts actually went on for about 3 whole months. They were just desperately searching for whatever may have been left of Daniel's remains. In the end, the search teams recovered Daniel's shoes, his shorts, his bout, and the remnants of his underwear. Now, in terms of what was recovered of his actual body, the search teams found about 17 fragments of bone in total, all of which, when DNA tested, were confirmed to have come from Daniel. And I believe that was it. To this day, all police recovered of Daniel Morcombe was 17 bone fragments. Brett Cowan was ultimately charged with murder, indecently dealing with a child under the age of 16, and improperly dealing with a corpse. And unbelievably, despite the evidence the police had collected against him, including his own confession on tape, he actually decided to plead not guilty to the charges, and he went to trial in February of 2014. But of course, he was incredibly delusional to think that he would continue to get away with this, because at the end of his trial, the jury found him guilty of all charges. He received 2 years in prison for the improperly dealing with a corpse charge, 3.5 years for the indecent assault charge, and life in prison for the murder charge. Now, his life term did come with the possibility of parole after 20 years. However, apparently the Judge Rosalind Atkinson, did say during sentencing, quote, "I don't think you should be released in 20 years' time." So hopefully he won't be. Hopefully he won't ever be released. I can't imagine that he will be. But I mean, who knows? He shouldn't have been let out after his first attack on Timothy Nichols, but he was after just a year. But I just hope to God, for the sake of other young boys, that they do keep him locked up for life now, because the risk that he poses is just far too great, in my opinion. Following Cowan's sentencing, Daniel's parents, Bruce and Denise Morcombe, made a statement in which they thanked every single undercover officer that was involved in the Mr. Big sting operation to catch Cowan, because, I mean, without them, without their hard work and determination to win over Cowan's trust over those like 4 to 5 months, Cowan probably would have never faced punishment for Daniel's death. Daniel never would have gotten justice. Now, in the aftermath of Cowan's conviction, there was a review into the police conduct surrounding the early stages of the investigation, the weeks after Daniel went missing, because as I've mentioned a few times, Brett Cowan was a person of interest very early on. He was interviewed just 2 weeks after Daniel vanished. So understandably, a lot of people were questioning why on earth it took so long for Cowan to be brought to justice. Why did he, I guess, slip through the net and was able to remain a free man for nearly 8 whole years after committing this horrific crime? And the result of this review was essentially that whilst police could not have prevented Daniel's death, as it was clear that Daniel was killed within about an hour of his abduction, more could have been done by detectives in the early stages, in the sense that they should have paid more attention to Brett Cowan. Yes, he was just one of many people of interest for the police at the time, but I mean, when you look at his criminal record, the fact that he had a history of abducting and sexually assaulting young boys, that should have been enough for the detectives to really hone in on him and focus on him as a top suspect early on, especially given the fact that, if you remember, Cowan literally put himself at the scene of the abduction on the afternoon that Daniel vanished. He fully admitted that he had driven past the bus stop that day. There were also gaps in his alibi, which the review concluded police should have looked more into at the time. The review also stated that the police should have taken DNA samples and swabs from Cowan's vehicle when he was interviewed. Had they done that, they may have have found Daniel's DNA. Like I said, there was nothing that could have been done by police at the time which could have prevented Daniel's death, but the result of the review was certainly that more focus should have been on Brett Peter Cowan pretty much right from the start, and that way they likely would have caught him way sooner. Also, in the aftermath of Daniel's disappearance, as we discussed earlier, his parents, Bruce and Denise, launched the Daniel Morcombe Foundation, which, if you remember, was originally set up as a way to keep funding the ongoing search efforts for Daniel. However, it eventually became much more than that. Bruce and Denise wanted to use the foundation as a way to essentially give back to the community that helped them so much after their son went missing, that showed them so much kindness and support, and they wanted to do this, give back, by just trying to educate people, educate children on stranger danger as much as possible, so that hopefully no other child would have to suffer the same fate as Daniel, and no other family would have to go through the pain of losing their loved one in such a horrific way. So in September of 2006, just under 3 years after Daniel vanished, the foundation released a DVD called Foundation Red, which was all about child safety. Over the years, Bruce and Denise would visit different schools all over the country and talk to the kids about stranger danger and consent and how to keep themselves safe. They provide lesson plans and activities for schools which are all about child safety. Just the year after Daniel disappeared in 2004, and I believe every year since, the foundation has gathered with the Sunshine Coast community to host the Walk for Daniel. It's an event where they walk the 4-kilometer journey that Daniel intended to obviously make himself on the day that he kidnapped but never got to complete, from the bus stop to the shopping centre. And another event that the foundation hosts annually, again still to this day, is on the last Friday of every single October. They host Day for Daniel, where they remember Daniel, they honour his memory, and they just try to fundraise as much as possible so that they can continue with the amazing work that they do to educate children and parents, and also to provide support to young victims of crime. They encourage everyone to wear red on Day for Daniel because Daniel was wearing a red t-shirt on the day that he went missing, and so many schools in Australia take part every single year. It's a really incredible event. And actually, by the time this video goes up, I believe Day for Daniel will be in just 2 days time for you Australians. I think this is going up on the 23rd of October, and I believe Day for Daniel this year is on the 25th. Honestly, the work that the foundation does, the work that Bruce and Denise have done in the years since their son's death is just incredible, and I just think that they should be so proud that they've created this legacy for Daniel in which they are protecting other children from predators like Brett Peter Cowan. I will leave a link to the Daniel Morcombe Foundation website in the description box if you would like to check it out and find out more about the amazing work that they do, and I'll also leave a link to their donation page as well in case anyone watching would like to make a donation. And that concludes this case. That is the case of Daniel Morcombe, a really heartbreaking case, a really wild case as well. As I said in the beginning, this is definitely one of the most interesting true crime stories that I've ever researched in terms of how the police went about solving this crime, doing the whole undercover Mr. Big operation, because it is such a risk for them to take, really, isn't it? You know, if Cowan suspected anything during the operation, had even the tiniest inkling that he was being set up, the entire plan would have just crumbled, and he never would have led the police to Daniel's burial site. But thankfully he didn't suspect, and this case was finally solved. I'm really looking forward to hearing all your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. Let's get a little discussion going as always, and of course also feel free to let me know in the comments of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which will be linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.